Welcome to everyone coming in. Welcome to our attendees. There's a few people still rolling in, so we'll just give them a minute and then we'll be ready to kick off. Now, for those who are comfortable, if you'd like to pop in the chat your name or where you're dialing in from, that would be wonderful. If you are a business owner, if you have a firm, if you are employed within a firm, a bit of a background of who you are, just so I can get a sense of who's in the audience with us today. All right, so it's 12:32, so we might begin. Hello, everyone. My name is Sheetal. My pronouns are she and her. And today I will be speaking with you about how to improve productivity and profitability through psychological safety and inclusion. It's a lot, I know. We will definitely break it down and we will make it relevant and relatable to you. I encourage you to make the session as interactive as you'd like. So if you have any questions or any comments, please, I encourage you to put them through into the chat box and I'll be able to see them. So let's kick off. So in this session, we'll be examining the intersection of psychological safety, inclusion, and profitability. And before we begin, I'd like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land from where we are all dialing in from today. I'm in the land of the Yugambeh language speaking people, otherwise known as the Gold Coast in Queensland. You may be familiar with the lands or the traditional owners of the lands from where you are dialing in from today. And if you're not, I'd highly encourage you to take a look. There's a website provided by IATSIS where you can determine the traditional landowners because we acknowledge that the work we undertake is on stolen land and sovereignty was never ceded. So we'd like to respect the traditional owners and pay our respects to the past and present leaders, especially when we undertake work that relates to diversity and inclusion, which this will. All right, so setting a few community guidelines. As I said, thank you so much for commenting that there's a law firm from rural New South Wales, Sam. Some community guidelines. So anyone that's here is encouraged to share as much or as little as they feel comfortable. And I'd like for you to keep in mind a few things. What were your goals? What did you come to this session wanting to achieve or wanting to learn? And if you're comfortable even putting that into the chat box, please do. What was it? Did you just want to learn more about psychological safety? Did you want to learn about what inclusion looks like, the intersection of the two? Did you want to know who I am? Are you just a friend of mine who's logged on because you're super supportive? So what was it that drove you to attend today? And what do you hope to learn from today's session? So if you don't want to write it down in the chat box, you can write it down on your own or just have a think of what intention you set for this session. Now, a little bit about me. And I recently went to a session and I saw the lady who was presenting shared a picture of her childhood. So at the very top is a photo of myself. I think that's grade 2. I'm at the bottom right corner. Don't know if you can see my mouse. Bottom right corner of the top left picture with the braids, and that was in grade 2. The reason why I bring this up is because when we talk about inclusion work, it's very rare that someone will be in the inclusion space because they haven't at one stage or another felt excluded from specific spaces. When I started school, because of the color of my skin, I was automatically put into a group with all of the English as a second language speakers. So students who had either just come from India because I was assumed to be Indian, and I was put into that group. By no fault of my own, I was a fluent English speaker. I was born and bred in Canada. but that's where I was included and I was excluded from the group. And even you'll see at the picture, there's a group of us that kind of group together. And we'll talk about confirmation bias and how that kind of how that comes up in groups and how that can contribute to exclusive behaviors. Now, what gives me the credibility to talk to you about this? Of course, I'm speaking to a room full of lawyers, so I need to earn that as this profession dictates. So I've actually been doing work in the diversity inclusion space for longer than I've actually been in the legal profession. So I've done an undergraduate degree in political science, where we studied about critical race theory, which I know is a very topical issue in the United States, and I don't think is an issue at all in Australia. And started a race and anti-racism network at the University of Fraser Valley, where I worked for quite some time. I've been speaking at panelists and on panels and international conferences since my undergraduate days, relating to issues about diaspora and diversity and inclusion and tangential issues. When I came into the legal profession, of course, in my early stages of the career, it wasn't something that I felt comfortable talking about, because you don't rock the boat when you're just grateful to have a position on the boat. And through my time in the legal career, which was actually just 6 years yesterday when I was admitted to legal practice, I've come to understand that there's a middle. And I like working in that middle. And that middle is a space where we connect people who are perhaps very radical in their views or very strong in their views about what needs to be done and how it needs to be done, and the rest of the profession that wants to do the right thing but doesn't necessarily know how. It can be quite polarizing, and I see myself as someone who sits in the middle. I've been able to access opportunities and spaces, and I sit on the Queensland Law Society's council, so that's a table that I have a seat at, which allows me to have bigger conversations with bigger impact about certain issues, which may not otherwise be able to reach those ears or those tables or those conversations. Similarly, I feel very grateful to Smokeball to be provided this platform to share with you a bit about psychological safety and inclusion. And of course, rolled in with all of that is a bit of discussion about diversity and how they all interconnect. So over years, I've built a practice. I have a law firm, and I've built a practice in the diversity inclusion space, and do some consulting about creating this safe space to have these discussions that look beyond unconscious biases and actually those systems and structures that inform those biases, such that we can actually look to what needs to change in that system. A lot of time when we have these discussions, we're looking about how do we create systems more inclusive to one person, instead of looking at the organization as a whole to say, what are we doing that is exclusive? What are we doing that's creating the need for us to then go out to be inclusive? Rather than looking at the organization, we keep looking at the individual. So I'm trying to flip the script and say, let's look at the organization and how do we set that up as an inclusive place to begin with, so we're not having to then have unique modules for different groups of demographics or different diversity dimensions to say, this is how we be inclusive to A group, B group, C group, and so on. Excellent. So as I mentioned, in this session, we'll be talking about what is psychological safety, the relationship between psychological safety and inclusion, and how to create psychologically safe and inclusive workplaces. So towards the end of the session, there's about 5 tips that we'll go through on how you can create an inclusive and psychologically safe workplace. Now let's begin at the beginning with diversity. And why is this important? Well, we've heard about the business case for diversity for quite some time. It's actually been around for about 25, almost 30 years now. And it somewhat started through a Harvard Business Review article, which I've put a quote up for you to see, spoke about the benefits of having a diverse workforce. Now, diverse could be diverse in culture, diverse in age, diverse in background. Ultimately, we're talking about diversity of thought. So any different background that someone might have may contribute to that diversity of thought. So it's cultivating a learning orientation toward diversity, one in which people draw from experiences as members of particular identity groups, to reconceive tasks, products, business processes, and organizational norms enables companies to improve their effectiveness. So that was kind of one of the quotes that sprung the business case of diversity and why diversity was important. Now, over time, that's been adapted, and we understood that to be recruiting and retaining more people from underrepresented or different identity groups. That's how we started to look at quotas. Then we started to think about, okay, well, leveraging their identity. How do we use what backgrounds, information they have? That's what the quote was about. That's what the business case of diversity was about. So let's bring in people with diverse backgrounds and backgrounds that are different than ours, and then let's leverage them as resources and use their experiences and knowledge to improve the organization or to benefit the organization. And of course, increasing more people from diverse backgrounds is more resources, it's more productivity and more profitability. So it became a bit of a numbers game, and we've ended up with why I've got that picture is an add diversity and stir situation where we look to bring people in from diverse backgrounds and put them in the room with hopes that it's going to improve business efficacy. But there's a missing link here. And this is all a part of the learning and effectiveness paradigm. If anyone's interested, it's a method that's one of the 4 popular methods when we speak about diversity inclusion in the business space. Now, we misunderstood the assignment. Something went wrong because forcing change didn't force inclusivity. So as you'd imagine, bringing a group of people from diverse backgrounds into an existing structure, which wasn't equipped to be a safe structure or an inclusive structure or psychologically safe structure, didn't result in the benefits of diversity that we kept being told would occur because we're missing that inclusivity. And the organizations weren't ultimately ready for the diversity of thought because there were no spaces created to have those discussions of diversity of thought. And this is where we bring in psychological safety as how we can fix this. So psychological safety, and I've got a quote up there from Amy Edmondson, who is attributed as one of the founders of this concept of psychological safety. It talks about a shared belief held by members of a team that they will not be exposed to interpersonal or social threats to their self or identity, their status or standing, and to their career or employment when engaging in learning behaviors such as asking for help, seeking feedback, admitting errors or admitting a lack of knowledge, trying something new, or voicing work-related dissenting views. So that, in a nutshell, is what psychological safety is all about, is having a space where people feel safe to be able to do all of those things, ask for help, provide feedback, raise concerns about a system that may or may not be working. Now, to this point, I'm going to share a few anecdotes with you. Now, imagine you have a nurse working the night shift in a busy hospital. She's making her evening rounds and she's reviewing treatment plans for patients, taking temperatures, administering medication. She sees that the dosage of one of the patients looks a bit off. She considers calling the doctor, but she's on shift on her own. And the last time she called the doctor after hours, the doctor was quite upset, made some disparaging comments about her abilities the last time that she called. She should have been able to manage that on her own. That's why she was left on her own. She was given that responsibility. So she chooses not to call the doctor and thinks, all right, the dose is in fact fine. No problem. The patient actually had an unusual condition and is on an experimental protocol, justifying the high dose. She thinks, okay, I know what the normal dose is supposed to be. I won't call the doctor. I'm just going to change the dose. She pulls the drug from the supply and heads for the patient's bed. This is an example of a not psychologically safe space. Now that's an example in a hospital with a nurse. Translate this to what this looks like for someone who's working in a law firm. A junior lawyer is taking care of some rudimentary tasks, looking at files, end of day file notes, looking at matters, what's going on the next day, preparing a to-do list for the next day, comes across a file and notices that there's an appearance the next day. Looks at the calendar, it's not in the boss's schedule. What do? Do they bring it up to the boss, who may or may not be receptive to this? And I appreciate this seems like a really rudimentary example, but these are actually examples that in my work with students have come up, where there's a hesitation to approach the senior manager and say, oh, I think you've missed something, because surely you haven't missed something. Or previously have addressed something and said, oh, I saw this this matter was coming up and I didn't see notes on this, but the senior manager is already across it and already aware of it and had it in their own notes, and it just wasn't the junior solicitor's business, let alone a junior solicitor. Maybe it's someone else within, maybe it's another partner, maybe it's another principal or another director within the firm. These are all, anytime we feel a hesitation to bring something up because we are afraid of what people will think or say or do, or what we will be seen as, or how that would make us look, those are all indicators that there may be room for improving the psychological safety of that space. Now, this quote talks about psychological safety at the crux of it is about interpersonal risks, creating a space where people feel safe, taking interpersonal risks. So this means creating an environment where there are no silly questions. If I ask a question, so if you've ever thought any of these things, it may be indicators that the space you're in could use some more psychological safety. Now, no organization is going to get it 100% right 100% of the time. It's just not possible. But more often than not, if you're answering, if these questions are coming up, then it may be time to consider whether that is a psychologically safe space and what you could be doing, and we'll get to that, to create a more psychological safe space. So if you have questions that come to mind of this ilk, if I ask a question, will I be seen as ignorant or dumb? If I make a mistake, will others think that I'm incompetent? If I question how things are done, will that make me seem problematic or negative? Now, this is really important, especially in the legal space, because we talk about innovation a lot and we talk about disrupting law a lot, which requires us to question whether things that are in place are working in the most efficient and effective manner. If we are in a space that doesn't allow for us to ask those questions, or if we're in a space where if we question something, it'll be seen as problematic, and that as a result makes us hesitate to ask those questions, we're not creating an environment that is ripe for innovation. If we ask for feedback, will I be seen as needy or insecure? So those are all some of the questions, and this is how we can do better. So we need to understand the importance of inclusion, of diversity. So again, referring back just moments ago when we talked about the add diversity and stir cocktail, that doesn't really work. You can't just get a group of people from different and diverse backgrounds, put them in a room and say, right, okay, efficiency is going to improve. You can't create seats at the table, but a chair is broken or someone's microphone isn't working. Those are things that hinder inclusion. So you can have the table and invite everyone to sit at the table, but if someone's chair is broken, or someone's chair is really low, someone's chair is really high, and it doesn't actually account for the specific needs of that person, or it's not inclusive of the needs of that person or the background of that person, it's not creating an inclusive space. So we need to understand the importance of inclusion, of diversity. Then we need to understand the link between inclusion and psychological safety. Now, psychological safety is imperative to fostering inclusion and innovation. It matters because it leads to healthier, more productive, and more inclusive teams. Where there's psychological safety, there's a sense of dependability in one another. There's role clarity, and there's intrinsic motivation to work hard. Only once we have created an inclusive space and a psychologically safe space can we leverage the benefits of diversity and reap the benefits of having the diversity of thought. So again, add diversity and stir cocktail doesn't quite work. We can bring in people from diverse backgrounds, but we need to create a space that's inclusive to people by having an organization that is psychologically safe. So again, remember when I mentioned I want to try to avoid looking at individuals and saying, how do I create this place inclusive for Sheetal or people like Sheetal? Well, spoiler alert, we're all individual people with unique needs and complex identities with intersecting personalities. So it's not going to be the case that one rule that fits for Sheetal, or by extension, all brown people, all gay people, all women. There's no one rule that's going to work. I deliver the training session for creating inclusive and safe spaces for LGBTIQ people, but that doesn't mean that that session is the be-all, end-all of what you need to do to create your organization that is inclusive to LGBTIQA plus people, because we are all complex individuals with intersecting identities. So instead of looking at those standalone sessions or those standalone groups, while they are very great to understand groups of people as a whole, if we start off with creating an environment in the organization that is psychologically safe, it is inherently going to be inclusive, regardless of that person's background, because you've created an environment that allows people to share their experiences. The inclusion training that's layered on top of that then would be consideration of cultural nuances or particular needs of that demographic. But the baseline is your psychological safety. If you have a psychologically safe organization, that is your foundation of trust, that is your foundation of dependability, and that is going to be the crux off of which all your innovation and productivity and profitability grows. And that's how you can leverage the benefits of diversity as well. Excellent. So there's 4 key stages. We're not talking about all 4 stages. We would be here for quite some time. We're talking about stage 1, which is about inclusion safety. Now, inclusion safety relates to the need to belong. If we feel like we are in a space where we're not wanted or we don't belong, we're unlikely to give feedback or contribute or take those interpersonal risks. If we don't have that basic level of inclusion safety, then we can't really progress to learner safety. And learner safety speaks to our need to learn and grow. Now, any guesses what contributor safety requires or what need it speaks to? You're right. It's our need to contribute. We like to be able to give. We've joined organizations, we've joined teams in order to give and to contribute. So we, first of all, have to feel like we belong, inclusion safety. Then next, we have to feel like we can learn in that space. It's safe for us to learn. It's safe for us to make mistakes. Then building off of that, we need to feel like it's safe for us to contribute in that space. Then we have challenger safety. Once we build a challenger safety, what need does that fulfill? If you say it's our need to challenge, you'd be incorrect. It's actually our need to be creative. So we don't necessarily have a need to challenge, though I'm sure there are some adversarial lawyers who would say they do. The challenger safety speaks to our need to be creative. This is where the innovation happens. This is where we think outside the box, and creating that safety, 1, 2, 3, 4 at challenger level means you feel safe enough to, for lack of a better word, poke holes in existing systems and explore other options and bring that to the team or bring that to the leader or bring that to the manager or the organization as a whole. So those are the 4 stages. So we're talking baseline level at inclusion safety. Now, in order for us to do this, we have to be able to shift our mindset. So we have to shift our mindset from judgment to curiosity, hence Curious George. We have to shift our mindset from being seen as perfect and expecting perfection to vulnerability and accepting that we will make mistakes and people will make mistakes. We need to shift our mindset from this false harmony. So everything's okay, everything's hunky-dory, everything's fine. We don't want to rock the boat, to having constructive agreement. which entails sometimes disagreement between parties, and being okay with that. We want to shift from adversarial to collaborative. We're not pointing fingers, we're actually learning to work together. So when something goes awry, we're not saying, oh, Sheetal was in charge of that. Sure, Sheetal may have been in charge of that, but what can we do as a team moving forward? And even if you are an individual or a sole practitioner working on your own, hopefully you have some support channels or networks. And I would be interested as to why you're taking a lesson on psychological safety when you don't have a team to take care of, but I suppose you're being proactive, in which case kudos to you. But you may be having, you may be taking care of all of those roles in yourself, or you're wanting to structure that before you onboard, which is a great thing to start with. All right, let's do a bit of a reflection, and I would love if people feel comfortable sharing, and you can put that into the chat or into the questions. But I'd like you to take a minute, so I can catch my breath, to think of a scenario. Think of the best team that you've been a part of, or the best manager you've had. How did they make you feel? As an employee, as a teammate, as a person? How did they communicate with you? What was their communication style? How comfortable were you sharing your ideas with them? And would you work with them again? By contrast, as you're feeling all those nice feels, think of the worst manager or team you've been a part of. How did it feel to be a part of that team? Could you even call it a team? How did that team communicate? Or if it wasn't a direct report, what was their communication style? Did they have a communication style, or was that half the problem, they didn't communicate? How comfortable were you sharing your ideas with them? Was there even a platform or an opportunity for you to share those ideas? Would you work with them again? Or is that the reason why you left? Those show the scales of different mindsets and different environments. Now, it's easy for me to say, change your mindset. You change from scenario 2 to scenario 1. Go from being adversarial to collaborative. Go from pointing fingers to taking accountability as a team. Go from judgment to vulnerability. All those things are easy to say, and I know that you understand all of those concepts conceptually, and you probably are able to shift that, but sometimes we need some practical tools and tips on how and what that looks like. So I'll give you a first tip. First tip is inclusive language. Now, language is power, life, and the instrument of culture. The instrument of domination and liberation is a quote from Angela Carter. We know the power of words, as I'm assuming most are lawyers tuning in. We know that there is incredible power and impact in the words we choose. We are very particular about which word we choose. Inclusive language is language that's respectful and promotes the acceptance and value of all people. When we use inclusive language, it can make people feel included, it can make people feel valued, it can make people feel empowered. It helps people feel like they belong. And I recall inclusion safety speaks to our need of belonging, which is our baseline. So that's why we begin with the language that we use. Now, when we think about the language and inclusive language, there are plenty of resources available around how to use inclusive language, gender neutral language, so that it's not specific to a particular binary. A good rule of thumb that I like to use is if I'm making a comment, if there was someone around from a particular background or particular denomination, would I still feel comfortable making that comment? So if I knew someone was disabled, or if I was sitting with someone with a person with a disability and I said, oh, that's so lame, would I still say that if they were sitting there? Not inclusive language. So anytime we feel the need to censor something that we're saying, because someone from that diversity demographic or that demographic would be effective. It's exclusive. It's not inclusive language. Same token, if we turned around and said, oh, that's so gay, and I knew my best mate was gay, well, would I feel very comfortable telling my mate about that story? Not particularly. So again, not inclusive language. And there are plenty of resources available through various institutions and organizations that speak about how to create more inclusive language in the policies that we use, in the procedures that we use, even in client intake and teams. So depending on your lens, there are ways you can have inclusive practices, inclusive language within your team, and then of course that's then mirrored to your clients as well. Now, this is all fine and dandy, and you're going to say, well, but the session's about productivity and profitability. I've talked to you about diversity. I've talked to you about psychological safety. What is the actual end goal and outcome of all this? Apart from it being the right thing to do, of course, there is productivity and profitability outcomes. You're empowering your employees and your clients. Clients and employees both feel seen, and then they want to work with you. We hear all of this discussion around the Great Resignation. People now realizing that they don't want to work for particular organizations, or the organizations are not suited to their needs, and so on and so forth. But ultimately, if the organization was I'm not saying that people that are leaving organizations are leaving because it's not a psychological safe. There's plenty of different factors. But if a space was psychologically safe, that would at least be one factor to help keep that person there. Because people want to stay in spaces that they feel safe, that they feel valued, that they feel like they can contribute, they feel that they can be creative, and that creativity is not admonished, but is rewarded. And that creativity is not just rewarded by to the individual, is rewarded, and the benefits are reaped by the organization as a whole. So as I mentioned, staff retention, client retention, and of course, free advertising. When you work for an organization that's amazing, you hear about it. Equally, how many of you have heard from friends, colleagues, family about the organizations that they hate working for? Free advertising. If we are working for an organization that creates a psychologically safe space, values what we contribute, we are more likely to share that information with other people about the organization and recruiting employees to that organization. And then those employees would also feel more comfortable advertising roles or recruiting more people to come and work for the organization. And when clients hear about the inclusive practices you have, not because we tell them about the inclusive practices we have, but because they are products, or they receive, or they benefit from those inclusive practices and procedures and policies that we put into place, they'll tell other clients and say, I felt really welcomed. I felt like they understood my unique needs because they were an inclusive space. Probably not the words that we'll use, but you get what I mean. All right, tip 2. Learning languages. So how many of you are familiar with love languages? I'm hoping some of you are nodding your heads. Now, love languages are the concept of discovering your preferred way of communicating with other people, or how people can best communicate with you. So I spin this a bit and say learn languages. Similar to love languages, we have different learning styles. Once we share with our team what our particular learning style is, which of course means we have to do some work to understand what our learning style is, we encourage others to do the same. This is particularly important for leaders in an organization. It's very helpful and very important when a leader of an organization is transparent and vulnerable and communicates how they need information provided to them and how they process information. Immediately, you can think of all the productivity hacks and benefits that results from this. Think of a scenario where I best receive information in a table. Now, if you can provide the information to me in a table, that's how my brain works, in tables. If you then send me, or if my staff member then sends me paragraph upon paragraph of information, one, I'm going to get frustrated because my brain is having a harder time trying to figure out what the information is. Whereas if it's put into a table of, I'll give you a clearer example. I do a lot of work in the NDIS space. So you have a disability and you're requesting a particular support and there's evidence for the support. I have had in situations where a student or an employee or someone is providing information and it's just block text of this is a disability, and it's all, if you put that into a table, and something like this really lends itself to being put into a table, disability, support, evidence required, and so on, much easier for me to understand. That avoids me having to go back and forth with that person trying to get the information in a way that is easier for my brain to understand. The reason why I say learn languages are important is because in a team dynamic, if you're able to understand people's learning styles, especially from a managerial point of view, you can address that better. The whole point of learning love languages is so that you speak in a language that that person can understand. Likewise, when you're speaking to your manager, you're speaking to your coworker, you're speaking to a client, you have to communicate in a way that will be receptive to them. When we're speaking to clients, we appreciate the value of speaking in layman's terms and not using legalese when we talk to our clients. So why do we not translate that when we are working with teammates? We know that it's better received when it's in bullet point versus text. We know Sheetal takes instructions better over the phone than in email. You can follow up with an email, but I will need to have some FaceTime with you to explain it. So let's just have the meeting and have the FaceTime and I'll take my own notes. Learning someone's learning style is important. And also from the self-directed point of view, when people discover their preferred way of learning, they're able to use their brain capacity more fully. Learning then becomes more enjoyable, it becomes easier, and we become more effective and faster at what we're trying to do. Consider this in the space of working with teammates, working with new tasks, or doing similar tasks in a different way. So this is what's called accelerated learning. So when we understand what our learning style is, we can then communicate that through inclusive language to someone else, or we can communicate that to our teammates, our manager, or our clients. Then we can facilitate that process. Right away, we know what the productivity hacks with that are. We work quicker, we work more efficiently, we save time figuring out team dynamics. And this can be inbuilt into the organization through professional development training. There are assessments that people undertake. There's Hogan assessments or values assessments or 360 assessments that organizations can take, some of which are free for us to learn about how we learn. We can only tell people about our learning styles when we know what our learning styles are. So that's an investment in myself, and I'll take that with me whatever organization I go to. The organization can benefit from me knowing what that learning style is, and then the organization, then we work with that person better, potentially quicker, and more efficiently. So tip one, inclusive languages, creating a space where people feel included, feel like they belong, they're not excluded. And then two, learning your learn languages. I'm just leaving you with a quote there. If a child can't learn the way we teach, maybe we should teach the way they learn. So if the systems we're using aren't necessarily working, perhaps we should consult with people about those systems and see what other systems we could be putting in place. Now, tip number 3 is related to looking at teams over talent. Now, this is looking at the group as a whole rather than one individual. We want to build a culture where teamwork is prioritized over the individual. The organization shouldn't really rise or fall with one person. This also requires that when we are in a position of hiring or recruiting or looking to expand our organization or our firm business, we're looking for people who are culture adds rather than culture fits. Now, remember initially I had mentioned something about confirmation bias. Now, we often hear we're looking for people that are the right culture fit. And I just had a conversation with someone and they're hiring and they said, we need to make sure that's the right fit because, you know, the dynamics of an organization are really important and we just don't want the wrong person in there because it could really throw the dynamics off and da, 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 da. While there is merit to that, and there is merit to, or reasoning rather, as to why we have these confirmation biases or biases in general. And that being, it's our brain's way of processing information quicker and protecting us. So if we had to go through a judgment step at every instance, and we were approached by a tiger in the wild, by the time we figure out whether this is a good tiger or a bad tiger, we would be a tiger that has eaten us. So in light of that, our brain has come up with these biases, which are quick judgments. But they are judgments. So we kind of have to unpack and unlearn these confirmation biases and understand that sometimes when we're looking for a culture fit, it means we're excluding people who may be a culture add. The outcomes of this is, if we always do what you've always done, you're always going to get what you've always got. So if you keep hiring the same teammate in just a different iteration, and they could be a person from a different background of a different age, but in essence is the same person, we're not really actually getting that value add, because we're not adding anything to the mix. We're not adding anything new to the mix, rather. We're just creating more of what we have. We're expanding more of what we have. So we look to people who are actually fitting in gaps in our talents and in our skill set or in our talent pool. And a good way of doing that is, if you're part of a board or a team, is to do a bit of a skills inventory. So what are people good at? And again, this relies on understanding what your learning styles are and what your strengths and your values and more things associated with you. Only then can you fill out what we call a skills matrix to identify, okay, right, the team is missing someone who is really X or who has Y skill set or Z, background. And then you can look to value add through culture add to your team. And that's a more inclusive way of looking at the recruitment process and avoids confirmation bias. And the productivity and profitability hacks, of course, we achieve better outcomes through collaboration. And that in itself, to expand, if I have a problem and I think of it with my vast background and knowledge and experience, it is still limited to what I know. If I then collaborate with you, I actually have the benefit then of your background and your experience to make that solution for the client, let's say this is a client scenario, better. If we then add a third person to that discussion, they add their perspectives, their background, their perceptions to that. Say we had a fourth person who actually shares the same background as a client. That's next level. This is why we have discussions around the importance of having a legal profession that's actually representative of the communities that we serve, so that we understand what it is that our community needs, what it is that the client needs. It's really important to have that understanding of background to be able to do that. Me, with my limited background, vast as it may be, is still limited to just me. So there is incredible power in collaborating, and then there's incredible power and validity to outcomes that we achieve, or solutions that we come to, or suggestions that we come to through collaboration versus one person's opinion and approach. They may be the smartest person in the room, they may be the most talented person in the room, but they are still not equivalent to 2 people, 3 people, or so on. And the benefit, of course, is when you have that diversity of thought, leverage that. You can only leverage that when you create a space where people feel comfortable sharing. So you can only capitalize on those new ideas, those diverse ideas, if we create a space where we are able to hear them, where someone feels comfortable sharing them. Now, tip number 4, relates to checking in. Now, check in before they check out. What does this mean? It's catchy. Checking in before people check out in meetings, in workplaces. You can have regular check-ins with your teammates. We have to appreciate that not everyone feels comfortable in big rooms and spaces. If you have a big team and you have a big floor meeting, not necessarily the space that someone who particularly identifies as introverted is going to feel comfortable sharing what their thoughts are. So it's good, again, when we learn the person's style and say, oh, I'm better to speak one-on-one, or I prefer smaller groups. you can have a set fortnightly one-on-one check-in or whatever the case may be with them. So that's on an independent level of checking in with someone on a regular basis. When we're looking at meetings, again, looking at a more practical, tangible example, checking in at the beginning of the meeting to ensure everyone's okay. Now I get it. I go into meetings very driven by action items, and I leave meetings with action items. I'm not, if you catch me on most days, we'll have a chat, but I'm really just trying to get to what you need from me or what I need from you, and get to the deliverable item and move on. We're busy, we're here because we're actually trying to figure out how to be more productive and profitability hacks and so on and so forth. So we don't necessarily have the leisure and luxury of the time to sit and say, hey, Sheetal, or hey, Kim, or hey, Sam, how's your day today? Like, let's have a chat. We have 20 minutes for this meeting. We've got to run this meeting. Check-in is just a quick look, glance over to make sure everyone in the room is okay. If someone's come in running into the room all in a huff and a puff, they need some time to decompress. So just a quick check-in, be like, hey, is everything okay? Is good in those circumstances. Where there is more time, and we need to be better, I think, as a profession generally, to create more space and buffer times in our life, to ask and do a roundtable check-in. Say, hey Kim, how have you been? What's going on for you this week? Before we get into the crux of the issue. Now, like I said, I appreciate that's not something that we're able to do every single time, but we do need to make a point of creating space to have those discussions as well. We're not just resources, including yourself. If you're the manager and you're the person who the buck stops with you, you're not just a resource for the benefit of the organization. You are also a human. I know it goes without saying, but we tend to forget that. We need to be able to look at people in a capacity as individuals and as humans beyond what they are value adding to the organization. The productivity and profitability outcome from this, of course, is when we give people that space, we check into how they are, we make them feel like they belong. Again, inclusion, safety. We then create space to learn from one another because we've learned about their learning styles, and we use an appropriate language to do so. And then we get to the contribution stage. This is why we talk about meetings now. So in meetings, we like to create a space where everyone contributes, but not everyone does contribute. We now live in a world that very much celebrates and prioritizes people who are extroverted. Now, if anyone's read the book Quiet by Susan Cain, you know where I'm going with this. There's incredible power in people who are introverted, but the systems and the workplaces that we now work in really celebrate and are very much catered to people who identify more as extroverted. Now, there's certain instances in which people who are introverted will display extroversion traits because it aligns with the work and the value, and they've told themselves that they can do this for the purposes of the job. That's not being insincere, not being inauthentic. They just appreciate that that's what the job takes and it's important to them. When we think of workplaces which are open floor plans, very loud spaces potentially, a lot of collaboration and thinking, not particularly a bad thing, but not everyone works in that way. Similar in meetings, not everyone who has a brilliant idea is going to be chomping at the bit to share that brilliant idea. Doesn't mean someone sitting beside me who is quieter doesn't have a brilliant idea or perhaps the best idea. The way we circumvent this is through check-ins. So this is a different check-in to the, hey, how are you going? How are you? So on. This is more towards the end of the meeting when we're going through and asking any final thoughts. Now you can't use a blanket statement of any final thoughts because again, that's opening up the floor for someone to have to volunteer themselves. Now we have to meet people where they are, speak the language that they speak, seek first to understand, then to be understood. All of these cliche things that we hear actually are rooted in some value, which is we have to meet people where they are to get the information from them. So going around the table, Kim and Sam, I'm sorry, the two names that popped up on the screen, so I'm going to be using your name rather. Kim, did you have anything further to add to the meeting? Or Sam, did you have something to share? It's not necessarily putting them on the spot. Well, it is rather putting them on the spot. And of course, if that's something that the person has identified I don't like doing, then we don't do that. But usual circumstances, that's an act of inclusion, because in some cultures, people don't speak unless they're spoken to. If a senior person is talking or if someone's junior in the room, you don't contribute unless you're asked to contribute. And that doesn't necessarily have to be just a cultural thing, as in race or ethnicity cultural thing. That could be a culture that the organization has set, that all the senior partners are talking, not necessarily a space for the junior solicitor or the clerk or whoever in the law system hierarchy is lower. So creating that space helps that person feel belonged. How incredible would you have felt, or have you felt, in circumstances where someone's come to you and asked for your opinion and said, hey Sam, I'd really value your opinion on this. What do you think on this project? What do you think is the best way for us to approach this? I can't really figure out, if this legislation is applicable here, or whatever the case may be, and they've come to you. Don't you feel important, as opposed to putting your hand out there and saying, oh, I don't know if this is the right thing to say? Two very flipped scenarios. One, creating and empowering and emboldening psychological safety by not only creating a space for people to share, but actively encouraging and seeking it. And the other, putting the onus back on the individual who is hesitating because it's potentially not a psychologically safe space. So that's just that's a tip or a trick or a technique that we can use in meetings, and then of course that can be expanded on when we have our discussions with people during our fortnightly catch-up or our monthly catch-up or whatever it is. And of course, these discussions or these techniques can also be mirrored in our teams, wider organizations, and then with our clients as well. Now, tip number 5, creating space. This is, so we went through inclusion safety, and then we went through learning safety, and then we went through contributor safety. Now we're coming to challenger, and challenger was about not challenging, creativity. Innovation and disrupting law, as I mentioned, are big topical things, but we don't necessarily have time to talk about how to innovate our practice because we're so busy in the day-to-day running of the practice. I get it. I have my own small firm. Some days I have to pick between doing the law or doing the business of law. It can be a lot to juggle, but you have to make a conscious effort to set aside time to innovate. Are the systems that I have working? Now it's very difficult, and my practical tip is to, if anyone out there bullet journals, add it to your bullet journal, or if you just have a notepad, I literally have a book beside me, and as ideas come to me, I will write them down. And then at the end of the month, I have a dedicated hour block where I look at those ideas and say, right, okay, I looked at, oh, my precedents need updating because they're no longer valid, or my valid in the sense that they're not as efficient as they used to be, or I figured out a different way to streamline this particular process, or this idea came to me and I want to explore that, or I read something interesting. Having a place to put those ideas in that moment takes it out of my brain for that time being and gives me the peace of mind that I know it will be addressed at the end of the month in my innovation discourse session that I've scheduled with myself. That's an invaluable tip, even and especially in circumstances where you're working with the team. Now, I don't know what your respective dynamics are, but how many times do you have, and maybe this speaks to the psychological safety of the organization, do you have people coming to you with ideas of how you can improve things? If not, maybe it's not a psychologically safe space for them to do so, and maybe there's some tips and tricks that you can do to make it so. If you're being bombarded, you've created a very psychologically safe space, and people are coming to you with all of these great ideas. If you set aside time in your calendar, whether that's during the one-on-one and a particular part of that one-on-one is about sharing ideas, or if you have a group think session within your organization, everyone has peace of mind that that idea will be heard. We like to think that we can multitask, but when we actually spend time doing multiple things, it takes away, of course, our energy from doing one thing at hand and spreading that energy across multiple things. So less time, energy, effort, brain capacity for that one task. When we allocate all these distractions and all of these great ideas to a specific time frame, even your teammates will start collecting their ideas in their own book and then bringing it to that meeting and sharing. So a few things that comes out of this creating space for discussions or creating space and dedicating time to business management, efficiencies, innovation, creative thinking, is it gives people a dedicated time to do that, and in doing so prevents them from bringing it up at all other times. Inherent productivity hack, because you're not getting pings every week, every day, and so on. You have a dedicated time and resource for that. And it gives a space for people to have that challenger safety environment explored, and it gives them the space to create and be creative and share ideas. In meetings and in those spaces, what I would also suggest is, in order to make an inclusive space, is to have a rotating chair or a rotating minute taker. So the same person is not the person writing the notes, because for that person's productivity, it could be detrimental if after every month they have now this additional task of taking the minutes, circulating action items, and so on and so forth. So in this way, you're sharing the load. So not one person's productivity is hindered, but everyone's productivity is hopefully elevated, because they're using that and expanding on their skill set and better understanding what different teammates are able to contribute, building those connections, feeling like they belong, feeling like they're part of the team, and learning how other people are working and what they're working on. Also an opportunity, of course, to collaborate with other people. So rotating a chair, rotating your minute taker. You could also have guidelines for your meetings, or guidelines for this particular meeting, but there's no interruptions. Each person has a 5-minute block, or whatever the time frame may be, to share their respective ideas, and they can do so. There's also something called the 1, 2, 4 all method. Now, I'm not quite sure who may be familiar with that, but I'll step through it really quickly. So it starts with 1 minute of self-reflection. Now you can kind of task this to people to think about in advance of the meeting. We'll have a reflection, or it could be their reflection is the culmination of all of their thoughts over the week or over the month, or however it may be. Then take 2 minutes to generate ideas in pairs, building on ideas that they had from their self-reflection. Then, depending on how large your team is, you can create groups of 4 or larger groups, and then use 4 minutes to share and develop those ideas you've discussed within those pairs. Now, of course, if your team's very small, you can kind of shorthand this. What this allows is it allows you to notice similarities and differences between particular ideas and identify themes. So the theme might be that there is a lack of efficiency in a particular process that we have, and people have come up with different ideas. So at least through the conversations about these different ideas, we've identified what the problem is. Then we can take 5 minutes to share insights, ideas, and takeaways by asking, what was the one idea that stood out in your conversation? What are the common themes? Each group then can build and collaborate on that idea, and then that's open the floor to everyone to discuss. And you might find that there are similar themes and ideas across different groups. So that's just another tip on how to make that meeting effective. And that, in a nutshell, brings me to your 5 productivity and profitability hacks as they relate to psychological safety and inclusion, and how we can leverage diversity to and reap the benefits of having diversity of thought through creating psychologically and inclusive spaces, and ensuring that we're not just doing the diversity and stir cocktail and missing out on the benefits of having people of diverse thoughts. And I've hopefully given you some takeaways that you can take away with you and learn how to create for yourself some psychologically safe practices and practices that create foster a more inclusive organization. Now, Smokeball had suggested I do a bit of a plug on all the things that I could think of. So here is my plug. So as I said, my name is Sheetal. I do wear a few hats. So I have my low bono legal firm. If any of you are specialists in your particular area or want to collaborate, what I do is I offer the firm on a pay what you can model to clients, and it is feasible. It does work. As you can see, I'm living, breathing, and eating just fine. So the model is sustainable, but it is sustainable because of partners like yourself, potentially, where if it's a matter that I don't know how to service, I take the matter on and I consult with someone more experienced like yourself, And I do the quote unquote grunt work at a low rate, which I've agreed with the client, and it allows you to maintain whatever fees you want to maintain. The client still gets a very subsidized cost, and it's a lot more accessible. So of course, the purpose of this firm is access to justice. I do also have the diversity inclusion training, which expands. This is probably one of the more commercialized sessions because it's looking at productivity and profitability. Also do race and anti-racism workshops, diversity inclusion, and so on. If you're interested in supporting any of the two organizations listed in white there, the LGBTI Legal Service, I work with them and they're constantly looking for partners or supporters for the work that they do. If that's of interest, please reach out. And of course, Out for Australia is an organization that I volunteer with as well. It offers Australia's largest free mentoring program for LGBTI youth. Whether you or someone you know would benefit from being a mentor or being a mentee, please reach out. It's really simple to sign up, and it's wonderful opportunities, and we're actively looking. We actually have more mentors than mentees at the moment, so I'd encourage you to share that resource for anyone looking for some mentoring. The purpose of Out for Australia is to help young people entering the profession to bring their authentic selves. So statistics show that people who were out in university tend to go back into the closet when they come into the workplace, and we're trying to create visible role models so that they don't feel the need to do that. So if anything on that screen, including the screen with my face on it, is of interest to you or an opportunity that you think you'd like to explore to collaborate on, please reach out. You can find me on LinkedIn, and I would be happy to connect with you all. So thank you all again so much for your time and for holding space for this conversation. I do hope you've been able to take something beneficial from this session today, and I wish you all the best of luck and hope you have a great holiday.